All right, so here we are in AP Lit, and we're going to talk about, for a few minutes, the book, and it's chapter 4. A lot of things you could say about it. We had some really good, again, the last class made me think. They mentioned things that I had not thought before, so I'm interested to see what you have to say. Anybody want to go first with this? I don't want to tell you what they said. Yes,
I
Willa.
mean, I just thought it was nice to have like basically a whole chapter off of like the Willie, like the story about Willie, and just kind of going into a new new characters and kind of like a past history of what had happened before Willie and everything.
For a big book, it was kind of a change of pace, wasn't it?
And it was just kind of nice that, I mean, I feel like a lot of people were kind of getting tired of Willie, and so it was kind of just like a break from him a little bit, so that was kind of nice.
You remember Beowulf, and they had these things we called interludes, like the Frisian slaughter. They were breaks from the story of Beowulf and Grendel and Grendel's mother, and yet they related. And that's one thing I hope you're going to be able to see eventually is how the story of Cass Master what it contributes to Jack's own story. Sarah.
I think it's interesting that Duncan, he introduces Cass to like drinking and gambling, but he also like introduces him to like prostitutes. So I think it's interesting that he was doing the same thing that his wife was doing, but when he found out that his wife was doing it to him, he was so distraught about it when he was doing the exact same thing. And
Yeah, I've never thought of that. Maybe
Yeah.
it's the male, whatever, the male.
like it was
whatever.
fine that he was doing it, but as soon as he found out that she was doing it to him, he fell apart.
That's very interesting. Thank you for saying that. Yes, and we'll go to Avery.
I guess this is gonna go against what Sarah said, but I remember the book talking about how, like, the crowd that Duncan was a part of introduced Jack to prostitution.
Not Duncan?
But it talked in depth about how Duncan, like, it made the fact that his wife cheated on him even more sad because Duncan was so in love with her, like, that she was the only person he ever thought of. Like, every time he walked into a room, he always just looked at her. His eyes were only for her. So I just thought that the way that it defined that made the fact that his wife cheated on him even sadder.
Well, I guess we just need to follow up on, but that part I definitely know that he was in love with her. Made that all the more worse, that she would be so callous toward him. Thank you, Liam.
Well, now I might be confusing both of them, but
Why not?
kind of going off of what Sarah said, it mirrors, or she might have even been talking about, it mirrors the way Willie acted last chapter, I believe, or how Sadie was mad at Willie, even though she was already cheating on him, and he was going out with Jack to the ice skating place with the people on the ice skates. So that kind of mirrors or at least what Sarah said, kind of mirrors what happened last chapter. If that, or she might be getting.
No, that's definitely, with the adultery and the cheating, that's definitely mirrored in Willie's life, not Jack's, if we can tell. He's never done that, or he hasn't been married, but as far as we know, he never cheated in marriage. But you're right, that definitely, there's a connection that we already see. Yes, Tori.
I thought it was really hypocritical of Annabelle because after Duncan committed suicide, she asked Cass if he ever thought about what he was doing to his friend and like how it would hurt him. But like that was her husband too, so she was doing wrong, or she was cheating on him as well. So it was very hypocritical of her.
Do you remember his answer? Why didn't he think about his friend? It's not just some other man's wife, it was his friend's wife, the same friend who's allowing him to live in their house or with them. Did he ever answer that? I don't remember an answer, how that made him. Did he ever regret it? Yeah, but he couldn't stop it. That's how I remember it. He did have regret, but the sin was too powerful in him. Not much of an excuse, but it is an explanation. Yeah, Sarah.
I also thought it was interesting that Annabelle, is it Phoebe or Phoebe?
Phoebe.
Phoebe
interesting
When-
thing,
yeah.
we already saw another Phoebe.
Yeah, when Phoebe found the ring and Annabelle like sold her to someone else, she ended up selling her into more sex work, which I don't know, considering the circumstances, it's kind of ironic.
Yeah, and just because of a look, that was all it was based on. You look, I remember reading, these were horror stories, and you read certain books about what it was like, racial issues, 150 years ago, that, you know, say a black man or a black woman couldn't look on look a white man or in the eyes. You know, that would be anything that suggested equality was awful. You know, can you imagine having not that? You cannot look somebody in the eye because that would, you know, they're exalted, and you know that's how tight this was. You had to play it really carefully. Yeah.
First, I'm excited to see how this side story, which seems unrelated to the main plot of the book, will eventually tie into, you know, like Jack's fear of responsibility, and just see how that turns out. And also I found it really interesting how the story of Castmaster opened with Jack at his desk as a college student with all of these boxes of papers, and he had the gold ring of Duncan Trice. Is it Trice or Trice?
TRICE.
Trice. Because I always find the past really interesting, and so I didn't really understand his lack of interest in wanting to understand who this man was, who he resembles so much in his character, or actually is more of a foil for him because Castmaster had taken on his responsibility for his actions and Jack doesn't want to. But it talked about how he left those boxes of papers and letters, things in his handwriting unopened for years, and I don't understand how he could do that.
Yeah, you know, they are related. I just double checked that. Were you gonna say that?
Yeah.
Well, you can explain it.
Well, he's like the uncle to Jack's father. He's one of the uncles to Jack's father.
That's a pretty close, you know, time-wise and blood-wise. So, somebody pointed out last period, I don't wanna steal anything, but, you know, Jack tries to run away from his past.
Yeah.
And that's what you see here, because he's actually investigating his past when he investigates an uncle, because they share, again, the same, there's a lot of similarity there. Liam?
Well, Taskmaster is also kind of like an accentuated emphasis of some of Jack's worst characteristics, or at least his overall character so far in the story. Whereas Cass made one like really bad decision that kind of messed with the rest of his life, and Jack, well, he hasn't really made like a terrible decision. His decision to work for Willie isn't like a good thing, and it's kind of messing with his character, making him less of a good person. And obviously, we haven't seen how it ends, if he makes up for it or if he just continues down this path. But it's just kind of interesting to see. Maybe it's foreshadowing of what happens.
Yeah, you brought up a good theme there. I don't wanna steal anybody, so I'll write it down and we can come back to it. Kinsley?
I just thought it was interesting how after Duncan died and they found the ring, instead of just like Annabelle showing it to Cass, she like put it on his finger.
Yes, tell me about that.
Maybe it's like Cass was like the reason that Duncan died.
Right.
So like,
What does it say about her, about Annabelle?
maybe that like she's, like Cass kind of taking the place of.
Yeah, I mean, well, how callous, you know, I mean, that relationship meant nothing. Here, you put it up, doesn't really matter, it's just a ring. Yes, or,
I was just gonna, kind of going off of what Kinsley said, Annabelle's whole, all of her, everything that she does in the thing, I just think is really weird. Like, that her husband was so in love with her, I got the impression he didn't cheat on her, even though other people.
well, we need to just say, we can settle that.
I thought it was interesting just how like, I also got the impression that Annabelle kind of initiated the affair.
Yeah.
So I thought that it was like, she initiated it, he kills himself and she puts the it's just so weird to me, her whole.
It's too real too, isn't
Yeah.
it? I mean, those kinds of arguments, you're blaming me for something and my answer is, but you did it too. You know, you're guilty, deflecting your own responsibility for how you cheated with your husband to the person who's telling me this also cheated on a friend. That's infuriating because she's trying to avoid responsibility, just like what's his name, Cass did. Yeah.
I'm wondering if Annabelle ever even really loved her husband at the beginning, or if it was just a one-sided relationship the whole time.
Well, I'm not asking you to be a psychologist, but what do you think? Someone who could do what she did to him, is that person, do you think she could have really ever loved?
I mean, it just seems to me like he couldn't have fallen that in love with her if she wasn't at least, maybe she was just leading him on the whole time.
It's hard to imagine people doing that, but people do that, and maybe she just saw a better deal. Yeah, I like this, but I like this better. And responsibility is not a factor. I'm not bound to anybody. I like this. I'm gonna have this because this is better than this, even though we're talking about human hearts and relationships.
I just think the whole structure and the way the author organized this scene of Cass Master is just really interesting, and it's very clear what he was doing because he goes into all this detail about Cass Master and all of his story, and then it just goes straight back to Jack and how he doesn't touch it again. And I just think that really highlights the fact that it's gonna be important later, and that
Good. Yeah.
it's gonna, just the way he phrased everything and it so abruptly was over. I just think it highlights how it's gonna come back and
That's-
Jack's not done with the story.
That's good thinking, and also the story is very chronological. You know how the book has been not that way. It's 1936, 1923, 1939. It's just back and forth. But that particular story starts at the beginning and then it ends, but not really ends. There's still more to come. Let's see what Colleen's got.
Well, it's kind of like Jason saying, I don't understand how Duncan was so in love with her, Annabelle, and she wasn't that love with him. It makes me wonder if she ever had a motive for why she married him. I don't think it ever goes into certain details about why she did.
No, you
But
don't get
the
that.
only way I could justify, I guess, not really, but is her having a motive. I just wonder if she had one or not.
For the original marriage with Duncan, it was for money, prestige, and she didn't really love him. I agree, you're not looking for an excuse, you're just looking for an explanation. Yes, that's right.
Well, this is a really minor part of the story, but I thought it was weird when Cass mentioned the story of the wealthy woman from Boston who abused her slaves, and how he used this story as a really almost an immoral way to justify having slaves, and how he described how she had slaves and she beat her slaves, but she did so because she hated slavery, and how she hated the way that her slaves looked at her, and so she got angry because of that, so she did that. And I think that was just a confusing story. It's if you think about it, it seems logical, but you can't really understand it because it's so immoral. And so I just thought it was weird that you mentioned that.
I need to reread that, that's a really good point. It does show you that everybody's bad in the book, because people in Boston didn't own slaves, did they? I guess even at that time, well, you're studying it right now, right?
They were just servants.
Yeah, but they were
Yeah.
no really better than slaves.
Right.
Let's go to Clayton and make sure he gets.
I like the contrast between Gilbert and Cass, because Cass doesn't use the money, or doesn't really want the money, and he just wants to be ordinary, when he joined the Confederate Army, he just went to infantry, while Gilbert used status and money to be a captain. And I feel like that kind of mirrors what's going on with Jack, his mother, because his mother's just sitting on all the wealth and status, while Jack, he's just he doesn't really care about the money, so he's just going for his journalism and all that.
And Gilbert's really cold, and doesn't have any emotion. I don't like his attitude. I don't like Cass what he did, but Gilbert, though he doesn't seem to have done anything like that, he's just really cold toward people. And we'll go to Emily and Sarah.
I wonder if perhaps Annabelle entered into the marriage with Duncan out of obligation as an expectation for the time
if you know, the character Scarlett O'Hara, you've probably heard of her, you've never read the book, seen the movie, she marries a couple of times, she loves Rhett, but she marries these other people out of convenience, out of spite. She marries, the first guy she marries just because, you know, he was going to war and she needed to marry someone, of course he gets killed immediately, there are interesting motives for marriage. Karen, and then we'll go, I'm sorry, Sarah, we'll go to Karen and get to Sarah, then Court.
Something I thought was kind of interesting was like the way that Duncan killed himself, because it wasn't like everyone just kind of assumed that it was an accident because he was cleaning his guns and one of them went off, and so only Cass and Annabelle knew that it was suicide, and so I think it showed how much he loved his wife because he was willing to kill himself but make it look like an accident, so that way people wouldn't like ask too many questions about like why this guy killed himself.
Wow, maybe he's one of the few, if he's not also, what we said at the beginning, you know, if he didn't commit adultery himself, maybe he's one of the few good people. Sarah?
I thought it was kind of funny how all it took for Cass to come back to Annabelle was a note that just said, "Oh, Cass," and that was it. And he came back.
Yeah, that's pretty melodramatic, isn't it? Pretty romantic, you know, that's all it said. Yes? Yeah.
Well, I looked in the book and it didn't explicitly, it just said that when Cass went to Transylvania, that he learned about drinking and gambling and all that stuff, but it didn't say that Duncan introduced him to it. So it doesn't really put any correlation between Duncan and
All right, well, I feel better about it if that's the case, but maybe some of you could look at it. Can I just share before we go what the other class came up with? Somebody made a really good point. Duncan committed suicide without a question, but they basically concluded that Cass also committed suicide because he joins the war and doesn't shoot anyone. He joined the war to die, essentially. And so, isn't it interesting? That's a form of suicide. If that's the case, then we've seen 3 suicides in the book so far. You talk about not dealing with the past. You got Duncan, maybe Cass, and then you've got Mortimer Littlepaw. That's certainly a theme in the book. Yeah.
I think I would agree with that idea, considering that even though he was an abolitionist, he joined the Confederate Army, which would make him justified in not shooting anyone
Right.
on the opposing side. Whereas if he had joined the Union Army, he would have a moral obligation to
Right.
actually do anything.
And it shows you how ineffective everything Cass does. He couldn't get Phoebe back. He couldn't find her. And then when he goes to fight against slavery, he doesn't fight at all, and he fights for the wrong side. So he's completely ineffective. Yes.
Like you said, there's three suicides in the book, and then.
So far.
Yeah, so far, and there's, this whole book is about politics, how it changes people, it really reflects how politics drives people to do things.
Did you say politics? Say that part again, I just want to hear it.
Well, I think it really reflects how politics really drives people insane and drives them to do crazy things.
We know a little bit about that, don't we? We're living it, how crazy it can get. Anybody else? Sarah, you have the last word.
Did he like enlist at like the bottom rank even though his social class would have let him enlist higher?
What, say that again?
Cass like enlisted at the bottom rank even though that his social class would have let him enlist
Well,
higher.
that's an interesting question. Because that's true. I mean, you didn't have to have any military training to be an officer, not in a volunteer unit. You just, we like you, you can be our officer. All those Southern men knew how to shoot and they knew how to ride, so they had training, but no formal training where, that's pretty important when you got 600 men shooting together at the same time. You gotta know those, but that's a really good point. If there was anything else, Cass, and we just mentioned last thing, Cass, Jack seems to be avoiding his own past, but we made the connection with Cass Master, and it is his past. And then the judge is also his past, because he's a father figure, a neighbor, he looks up to him. So he can't avoid, although he seems to be trying to avoid responsibility. And last thing was, what Cass did, it hurt. How many people it hurt? It's just the cascade, snowball, ripple effect of sin. Thank you, I'm gonna write that down. I'm gonna pretend like I meant that. But you see how that works? He ended up hurting Phoebe, and he ended up hurting his best friend, and of course, all that. You never know when sin is gonna stop. All sin is like that. It has ripple effects. You say, I got this under control. No, you don't. Once it's out there, you can't get a hold of it. It will come back. Well done. Read the next chapter for next Monday. And I'm working on your quizzes. I started it already. So, you can look online for some. I put the paper grade up there, and I'll give those back to you Wednesday.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.